So what am I doing wrong? This is a question I get routinely when I'm working with folks for the first time. And in a recent conversation with a new client, they expressed this exact concern. So what am I doing wrong? As we discussed their plan and situation, what became more and more clear is that they were really more concerned with what they were missing. And I know they're not alone in having this fear. So in this video, what I want to do with you is go through an actual case study of a couple age 65 with $2 million in investments that just retired. We'll see how they've set themselves up to this point, and I'll discuss what I see as mistakes, or better yet, missed opportunities. We'll break down what those mean, as well as discuss many of the trade-offs certain situations can bring. But first, I'm Crossland of Suttle Crossland Wealth Advisors, and the purpose of this channel is to discuss financial topics and ultimately help people build more tax-efficient retirements. So let's just get right into it. So here we are in our case study, and we're going to be looking at a couple familiar faces. If you've seen other videos from me, we're looking at Joe and Jane. They are 65 years old. They retired at the end of last year. And this time we're going to say they have 2 adult children. We have Josephina, and then we have Janet. Neither are dependent. Both are actually having pretty successful careers. Josephina is an executive director at a large insurer, and Janet is a primary care physician, and both are actually raising families of their own. Now, as we go through here, I'm going to put on the bottom just the assumptions so we can kind of track those before we start to talk about what they may have missed or what their opportunities are. And again, the point of this is to try to identify Joe and Jane. Here they are at retirement. Is there anything that they may have missed? Or a better way to put that is what opportunities might still exist even though they're now just newly retired. Now, we're going to say that life expectancy for them is age 90. And we're going to say this because both of Jane's parents are still alive and they're into their upper 80s. And for Joe, his mom is still alive and she is 88, but his father passed away when he was 84. So we're going to go with the planning horizon of age 90 for both. Now, in terms of the income, we're actually looking at a situation where each of them has Social Security. But we're not saying that either really has an ongoing pension at the moment. Joe actually had a small pension. He had earned that with a city job some years ago, but he opted for a lump sum rollover when he retired last year. Now, even though we're saying that Social Security is going to be really kind of their, primary fixed source of income, it has not started yet. And if we actually take a look at the benefit amount at full retirement age for Joe, he's in line to earn $3,080 on his projection. And then for Jane, if we take a look at hers at full retirement age 67, hers is $1,917 per month. Now, both have expressed that they want to take this at full retirement age. They don't want to take it early, so they're going to wait until 67. So at least in the meantime, they've been living off of their built-up investments in cash and basically using that to pay for everyday needs in the retirement up to this point. And they plan to continue to do that. So we can see they actually have a number of different goals for themselves. First and foremost on the budget end, they want to spend $10,000 per month. This is what they want to budget for in retirement. And for that, we're actually going to be looking at a little bit more of a dynamic spending approach. They don't have a really hard line on, hey, it's got to be 10,000 or else. So we're going to use the floor and ceiling approach. All that is saying is that if there's a really good market year in the prior year, we'll be willing to maybe expand that budget just a little bit. If we have a negative or a bad market year in the prior year, we'll probably look to pull that back. And so that'll play out in the cash flows. Now, technically, we could look at anything. We could look at just a hard line, 10,000, just, adjust for inflation, or look at some of these others. But floor and ceiling tends to be a little bit more in line with what human nature is when it comes to navigating retirement or your expenses when you're no longer working and you're sort of at the mercy of whatever markets are going to be doing. Now, additionally, they do have a vacation budget goal. And, this can be a pretty big number to some, much like the budgeted monthly amount, but they're basically saying that we want to try to target, $20,000 in spending. We want that to be a per year figure, but we really are only probably going to do that for about 10 years. We've really kind of done it all. We really don't think we'll need to, be world travelers anymore. Maybe there'll be something that they'll do, visiting kids or grandkids, but their intention is really to just kind of bake that into the monthly expenses in the future. So this is a specific desire to have an added spend. That way they can kind of get the bucket list items checked off on all the travel destinations. Additionally, we're saying that they have a desire just to get a new car every 5 years. The dollar amount can obviously change. A lot of that's going to depend on what they like and what's available. But we want to add something in that way we can account for additional vehicle purchase as they age without that necessarily having to come in as a piece of the monthly budgeted amount. And then they do want to be very intentional with their charitable giving. And so they want to give basically $500 a month. They want that to be an ongoing thing. They want that to continue up until they pass away. Now, they obviously can continue to gift more, but again, we just want to build this in on top of everything that we've seen monthly. And lastly, we do want to try to account for some of the healthcare costs that they're going to experience in and through retirement. Now, they're at Medicare age, so that's really what they're going to be using. So you can ignore the pre-Medicare numbers. These are no longer applicable, in terms of describing what they might need to spend for insurance. But Joe actually does have a retirement benefit where he does get reimbursement from the job that he retired from previously, but it really only covers him. It does not cover Jane. So on top of the Medicare parts that they'll be paying for, we're going to assume a little bit of out-of-pocket costs additionally for some, healthcare needs for Jane. Now, the big question is, well, what exactly is going to support them? If they've got the Social Security, but they've not started it yet, what is available that they're going to use to kind of support their situation? So let's take a look at a breakdown of their assets and their situation. So here we see a couple bank accounts. These total right around like $50,000+. There is a taxable brokerage account, $337,000 there. We're saying that the house here, it's worth $600,000 right now. They've really decided not to include that in a review of their retirement capabilities. They don't want to be forced to move or, do some type of reverse mortgage or downsize. So it's here, it's a part of the net worth, but we're not saying that's going to necessarily affect anything related to their investment. And then there is a credit card, but they, charge the card and then pay it off. No current auto loans, no mortgages, no other debt of any kind. Now, to quickly highlight, if you look at the investments themselves, between the pre-tax accounts, between the taxable brokerage, the dollar amount on this is just over $2 million, or right about $2 million. Now, you'll notice there is no Roth IRA. Everything is still pre-tax or in the taxable investment or in the joint accounts at the bank. And so now, for the sake of this case study, we're actually going to look and see how their investments themselves are sort of allocated. And so on the left here, we can see what their current portfolio composition is made up of. So they have very large portions in U.S. equities and U.S. bonds, essentially nothing through international markets, emerging markets, real estate. But there's a little bit more that we can actually glean from this if we take a look at how their categories are actually playing out. They're predominantly in large U.S. growth, and they're predominantly in high yield bonds. So even when we come back here and we take a look at their current portfolio and we say, okay, they're 57% equity, 43% bonds, when we take a look at the composition of that, we see that it's weighted very heavily into just a couple of categories. Additionally, if we take a look by account, if we actually look at that joint brokerage account, we see that it's very heavy into fixed income. And then there is a little bit of equity in there, but there's quite a bit of bonds making up the majority of the cash that is invested within the account. And then if we take a look at the retirement accounts for each, we see that Joe's actually a little bit above 60-40s at 65-35, and then Jane's a little bit below at 59-41. Now, for them as risk takers, in terms of retirement, where they feel most comfortable is going to be at 60-40. So 60% equity and 40% bonds overall. And so when we look at the whole, we can tell that they're really not that far off. There's a little bit of room that they have left to get back to that 60-40, but it's really the composition of the accounts that's going to be the most interesting part to me. And so one last thing just to note again, in terms of what they have liquid and available that's not invested in any kind of a stock or a bond, it's really these two accounts here, their joint checking and their joint savings. And we see that the total comes right in and around $51,000. So before we actually jump to the Monte Carlo, I'd be curious to know if you see anything that jumps out to you. Do you see an opportunity? Do you see something that they may have missed when it comes to the composition of their assets, when it comes to what they're doing in terms of their income or expense? Is there anything that you would look at and identify as somebody that is now retired that they should be doing to either better secure their retirement, or maybe you have more of a mind towards legacy, or maybe you have more of an eye on, hey, their future projections? What is it that you notice before we jump to the Monte Carlo? So think on that. But at this point, what we're going to do is actually take a look. I'm going to go through a few of these sections and identify what I see as things that would be opportunities that they would have missed, things that I would have, things that I would think they need to correct in order to get into a better position for themselves. And so now let's actually jump over and take a look at the Monte Carlo. And we can see, at least initially, they have a 94% probability of success. We do see a projection at right about 3.2 million on a median terminal account balance at the end of their lives, or age 90. So my initial thoughts are that even with some of the opportunities that they've missed, they still have a very strong probability of success. They still have an attractive median terminal balance of 3.2 million. It's still stronger than the number that we saw when we were looking at the composition of their assets. And so for a lot of people, this is great. But if you're like me, you want to make sure that if there are things that you should do, if there are things that you should consider to improve your situation, whether it's in the short term or the long term, you want to know what those things are. You want to try to organize yourself in a way that you can take advantage of that. Because remember, you don't retire for a day. If everything goes correctly, Joe and Jane here are hopefully going to live to the ripe old age of 90, and they really don't want to run out of money at any point before that. But just as importantly, they don't want to have to stress about it. Now, a couple things to note is they're not in a position where legacy has to be this really big deal to them. They have successful kids. They are building their own futures. They're doing very well to the point where some type of inheritance is not going to make or break their situation, but it would be a nice to have. And so the first opportunity that we're going to look at really, and I'm hoping you caught this as well, is that when it comes to the cash that they have available for a rainy day or an emergency, those bank accounts added up to just about $51,000. From a planner's perspective, when you're in retirement, you should have a healthy amount of cash. 12 to 18 months is typically what I look for. The rationale is that cash gives you arm's length from negative markets. If you need to support yourself with cash for a year, maybe up to a year and a half, the idea is if we're in a negative market, if we're in a recession, if we are in something that is going to require you to be a little bit more hands-off from the investment, that cash buffer can help to do that. Now, on the flip side, I come across situations all the time where I will see multiples of six figures of cash. I've even seen cash in the millions. The problem with that is that when you look at the historical returns of cash as an asset category, it underperforms both fixed income and equities in the long run. So having enough cash to cover an emergency or basically cover a healthy amount of time, 12 to 18 months, that is going to be a prudent decision for somebody in retirement. But once you start to extend beyond that amount, that's where you start to fall into the trap of the cash drag. And even though interest rates have been much better over the last few years with inflation having gone up, if inflation is something that does come under control, the Fed's plan is to try to reduce the target interest rates lower. Ideally, they want to see inflation somewhere in the 2 to 2.5% range on average. So what would 12 to 18 months of cash look like for Joe and Jane? Well, if they're going to spend roughly $10,000 per month, you'd want to see a yearly figure somewhere in that $120,000 range. If you were to go, let's say 18 months, what that would look like instead would be somewhere in about that 180 range. So they do have a shortfall. Now, if you're an astute observer, you might look and say, well, they have all the fixed income over in the taxable account, and that's a fair point. Joe and Jane could carve away some of that fixed income and specifically pull it over to cash. And the argument for that would be they could get it into an account that's maybe FDIC insured, get it somewhere where it's immediately liquid and they don't necessarily have to worry about, further costs to access. But the other point, and it may be just as important, has to do with why they should also reduce that risk. And maybe some of you noticed, if we take a look again at the composition of that joint account, they have a lot of these funds over here in, high yield bonds. Well, high yield, otherwise known as junk bonds, they are going to be more susceptible to interest rate changes. They could have credit risk issues. High yield also tends to be more correlated with equities when there are negative or scary markets. So if they find themselves, in the midst of a recession or some type of major market pullback or bear market, there's a strong possibility that the high yield here is going to be underperforming. They may be in a position where if they need to go get other assets, they might have to consider selling some of the high yield. It could be at a discount, meaning they would be selling it for less than it's worth. So you really don't want to put yourself into that position where if you need additional dollars, if you're in the midst of negative markets where you are forced to have to go access certain investments that may be fluctuating depending on what market conditions are, then some people will say, okay, well, they have the municipal. Well, municipal bonds and high yield bonds, they can experience some of the same effect. when there is a recession or, again, negative markets, people tend to flee high yielding municipal and go more towards government. So at least, yes, they do have some government bonds, but this may or may not be enough to cover that 12 to 18 month need. Now, if you want to play 4D chess with this a little bit more, you could also consider from a liquidity standpoint, well, do they have enough to perhaps facilitate other planning needs within their retirement? And the big one here that we'll look at in a moment, this is another opportunity coming up here, is going to be the tax planning. But with them being age 65 and not yet having started Social Security, not yet having to worry about required minimum distributions, they're in a very low income environment. So conversions may be something that they want to look at. And what that would require is an ability to facilitate the conversions themselves. So cash is going to help do that. And depending on what they would look to do, if they're convicted to undertake that, would be additional cash to basically pay for the tax liability. So a big opportunity again for them is to get their liquidity to a healthier spot. And this, by the way, is something that you could do. So if you're kind of looking at this and you feel like you're, somewhat in a similar situation, leading up to retirement the last 2 or 3 years before you actually retire, that can be a pretty opportune time to build the additional cash. Again, you don't want to suffer from too much cash drag off into the long term, but having some is just prudent. The idea of it maybe having a little bit of drag for the sake of safety and the facilitation of other strategies, that is an opportunity cost that I think is worth taking. Now, I'll make a quick point to another opportunity that jumped out to me over here in the Monte Carlo. And even though they're scoring at a very high clip, if they wanted to improve this further, there are things that they could do. Honestly, the easiest would be just simply adjusting some of the spending numbers. And these might be assumptions that could be changed in a way that they may never notice. So if they just simply reduce their spending by, let's say, $500 per month, in essence, they're changing from $10,000 a month to $9,500 per month. I don't know if they'd exactly feel that in their lifestyle. But here we've seen a bump. We've seen a 2% improvement in that probability of success. We've also seen a pretty good improvement within that terminal balance or that median terminal balance number. If they wanted to know, well, hey, how do we hit that 99 or 100% mark? Well, really, it could just be the adjustment on how much they are planning to spend. So 9,000 instead of 10,000, improve the numbers even more. And I'm sure if we drop this again to maybe 8,500, then we'd be looking at, another improved situation here. So 8,500, there we are, 100% probability of success. 4.4 million is a pretty big uptick from what they were doing before. Now, some of you might look at this and say, well, $8,500 a month, are they going out to eat every night? Or are they just spending lavishly? I don't even know if I could spend that if I tried. And others of you might say, $8,500 a month, that's nowhere even close to what they're going to need. Everybody's going to be different. So for their situation, if they wanted to, let's say, have an opportunity to improve what their projections look like, making some adjustments to expenses is going to be the easiest way if they have the capability of doing that. To somebody else that's maybe sitting at, like a 50% Monte Carlo outcome who's spending, $3,000 a month and they're kind of on a razor's edge margin when it comes to what they can change in spending. Yeah, it's going to be a lot different situation and scenario. But Joe and Jane are in a position to be able to make choices like this. Can we spend less? Are we willing to do that? Will we even feel that within our lifestyle? But if they can, if that is something that they want to make a conscious effort to do, they can further improve their opportunities here. Now, they may not even have to do that. When we look at some of the other tools available to us, what are some of the other things that we can do? Well, the other big opportunity to me that we'll take a next look at here is going to be Social Security. So on their current plan, they're going to wait till full retirement age, basically 67, to begin taking that Social Security. But they actually do have a quote unquote optimal strategy of both waiting until 70. And some people hate this notion. I can't tell you how many times I've seen comments or people say, why on earth would I wait till 70? I want the money now. Well, the reason you would take it at 70, there's a couple. Number one is if you live a long time, if you live past the break-even point, that is when Social Security is going to start to pay you more in terms of your lifetime. If you live to be 100, delaying as long as you can is going to correspond with the highest total payout. The other big reason is this. especially in a spousal situation or a situation where somebody has to worry about the Social Security benefit that they are leaving. If you have a survivor who's counting on your Social Security, delaying as long as you can is going to provide them with the biggest benefit should you predecease them. So if Joe were to die at, let's say, 72, and Jane had to keep living, well, we saw before that Joe's benefit is bigger. Him delaying until 70 is going to provide her with the best survivorship when it comes to the Social Security. And so delaying until 70 is a big opportunity for both. They would project to have higher total payouts. When we look at the break-even age 80. And if you look at the CDC numbers on, well, what is my life expectancy average from age 65? It's somewhere right around about 18 additional years. So they have a good chance of living past age 80, at which point both of them delaying until 70 is going to be a benefit, at least as it relates to the potential and projection of their lifetime assets. Now, this video is not about arguing if Social Security is going to stay solvent or not, or if things are going to change. It's just looking at the information that we have right now. So take everything that you see with a grain of salt on this. But one other benefit, one other opportunity that comes from the delay, not just having an improved projection of total lifetime payout, but now if we take a look at what happens in the delay of their situation, so we'll put their spending back at 10,000, we'll change their Social Security strategy to say optimal, so essentially both delaying until 70. If that's the only change, then when we look at their Monte Carlo, they do have a slight improvement, at least as it relates to the projection of the terminal balance. Now, is this enough for somebody to say, well, I'm going to delay till 70 just on this information alone? Probably not, but it is an improvement. It is something that is worth noting. Now, they will have to live off of their investments for a little bit longer to facilitate that, but again, the benefits that come from that delay, I think, outweigh taking it early, at least in their situation or circumstance. Now, the other kind of hidden benefit to all this is they would potentially be keeping their income lower by delaying until 70 as well. And the reason would be to facilitate something up here in the tax strategy. So let's talk about the tax strategy, and then we're actually going to talk about what I think is a really big opportunity that I saw within their investments. So if we take a look at the tax strategy for them, really their options are to either try to keep their income as low as possible, enjoy a few years of lower income for the sake of lower income taxes from, let's say, age 65 till maybe 70 or whenever they decide to turn on Social Security. But eventually, they are going to have to start dealing with required minimum distributions. At their age, they're looking at basically age 75. That is when they're going to have to start taking required minimum distributions. And so what is that benefit, again, of potentially delaying Social Security to 70? Well, is they have those extra years. Instead of taking it at 67, they have those 3 extra years to essentially consider doing conversion strategy. And if we take a look at the solver within Right Capital, it's telling us that they may be able to, optimize their best tax-adjusted ending asset number by going somewhere around that 22 to 25% ordinary income bracket level. So if we come over here and we set that to the 2225, and if we take a look at what's happening, well, here we can see that they would have these years up front. Before Social Security kicks in right around here, they would have these years to prepay. They'd be converting and prepaying the tax on that conversion. And if they continue with that, you'll notice this actually has them do that in spite of eventually hitting RMD age. But the reason why you would do this is because the alternative that we see in the blue here is that there could be more years at higher amounts of income distribution. And this is something that would then accelerate what their lifetime payout would be in terms of tax. Now, a couple things to highlight is that if they end up living longer than 90, this situation gets worse. Where would conversion strategies fail? Well, conversion strategies would fail if they both ended up dying somewhere around age 75. So there is not a magical, like, oh, I'm going to convert everything's going to work out and be great. No, there has to be a degree of conviction when it comes to these tax strategies involving things like conversion, because you will be paying pre-tax, but the reason to do that is right here. Can I end up having, a better tax-adjusted ending asset number? Is there a potential to pay less in total taxes? Now, for them, they might look at these numbers and say, there's just not enough juice for the squeeze here. I'm not going to worry about it because I don't know if I'm going to die at 80. Maybe I'll die at, 75. So they may decide that they are not going to be doing that, but this is something that they absolutely should be looking at and reviewing. And even if you undertake an approach to do conversions that's not trying to, maximize this great big number that you can do every year, you can still look at, is there a reason to convert any amount? Am I in a position in this year? Is the strategy maybe over the next 3 to 5 years such where I could get some benefit? The one thing that this software does not do is it does not take a look at the 10 years past death. And if we were able to project, and I've done other videos on this that you can look at in terms of the benefit of Roth conversions in the 10 years after death, but if you were to extend a look at, well, what happens in the 10 years following death, if assets are in the Roth account versus in the pre-tax account, there could be a much different experience on those assets in terms of their net after-tax amounts. So what I mean by that is if you left your family, let's say $4 million, and you died, and you left your family, or at least in Joe and Jane's case here, 100% of those dollars available to them in Roth IRA money. We saw from Josephina and Janet that are very successful and making lots of money. They would not be required to take anything out of the account if it's Roth IRA until the 10th year. So those dollars could continue to grow. They would be able to then distribute that at the very end, at the 11th hour, December 31st of the 10th year after they've inherited it, and get all of that tax-free. So imagine the account continuing to grow, staying aggressive, and then being able to distribute tax-free. Now, they could technically try to take the same approach over here. If Josephina and Janet get the accounts, and let's say they continue just to let it grow, and then, try to distribute as far away as they can just to let the account defer, well, they're going to have to deal with the tax consequence. If they get these accounts and Joe and Jane were in required minimum distribution years, they're going to have to deal with distributions every year over that 10 years. That's going to be income to them. Janet's a doctor. Her income is high. That's going to be added on top of all the other income she's going to have. Same for Josephina, high earner. Going to have the same issue. So there is a downstream effect that needs to be considered. This is an opportunity that they absolutely should be looking at for themselves, and then they need to make a values-based decision. I think they should do it, but in their case, they need to weigh the costs of doing that. It's a year-by-year endeavor, but at least from a strategic big-picture view, it does look like there is some benefit to them, and there's some added benefit potentially down the line to the kids. Related to this, in terms of tax planning, the tax efficiency of these investment accounts and the investments themselves also need to be addressed. The big opportunity is they just don't have proper allocation targets, and there are plenty of opinions out there. There's probably a million different ways that you can invest your dollars. My belief is that investors should be following more of a modern portfolio construction approach, having more of an allocation that is diversified closer to market weights. The reason for that is you have no idea how markets are going to go over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. The argument that I always get is, well, the S&P. Okay, Buffett says the S&P. Great. When you look at the actual breakdown in terms of the risk, you can measure risk as it relates to portfolios. The total risk measure is standard deviation. It is possible. The research has been done by Vanguard, by Fidelity, by Schwab, by all the analysts out there. There is no guarantee when it comes to investments, by the way. Past performance is no guarantee of future result. But you have to be more concerned with, well, how do I just get the most return possible? If I'm trying to be 60-40, how do I crank up my return as high as I can go? Well, if you start to narrow your exposures, you're going to potentially increase your risk. And yeah, you could potentially increase that annual return. But this portfolio has no mitigation if U.S. markets fall off a cliff and international markets hang in there. We saw that phenomenon a little bit at the beginning beginning of the year in 2025 where U.S. equities fell off, but international equities were doing well. If you take a look at the allocation, basically what this is highlighting is if they had a 60-40 portfolio that was more diversified, they would have more international exposure, including a little bit of emerging market, a little bit of real estate sprinkled in, and then a little bit of international debt. The cash is debatable. My opinion is cash should exist over in the emergency fund. So that 12 to 18 months or additional cash, if they're going to try to facilitate some of those conversions, that should be where the cash is held, somewhere safe, liquid, insured if you can, FDIC. I know a lot of people use money markets, but you want that to be safe and available. But cash within the allocation, to me, is going to add additional cash drag, and so it will technically skew the 60-40 a little bit out and away from the fixed income. Now, you have, I'm sure, your own opinion on what you would do, but this is what I believe most investors who are just trying to retire and enjoy their lives should do if they are concerned with, am I going to have enough money? Is my portfolio going to stay and be relevant 20 and 30 years down the line as markets and industries and things change shape? Now, there's another layer to this, and I'm hoping you noticed it. If not, hopefully I can point it out to you. Their asset location was not very good. And what I mean by that is where they place the bonds, where they place the stock. So their selection, in terms of what they're going to invest into needs some work. They have way too much large growth only, but they also have way too much high yield. And I want to make a point to this, going back to what I had said before. If markets are negative, high yield tends to be more correlated to equity. And so the issue there is if we have a recession, dollars are going to flow from high yield. They're going to flow from municipal, probably some corporate, especially if it's below investment grade, and it's going to flow up here to government, treasuries. That's a problem. If your portfolio is losing value in your stock because markets are negative, you don't want your bonds to do that as well. The whole point of having bonds in your portfolio is to act as a counterbalance. You want those to be investment grade and above, largely U.S. treasuries and government. You want a good spread across different maturities. You also want to have a reasonably intermediate duration. You don't want to get too crazy with that. And the only reason or arguments I ever see outside of that are for investors that just have such an appetite for risk that they want to run their own portfolios based on their own hypotheses and based on their own beliefs. But to most retirees, you have to be concerned with, how do I preserve my purchase power now? How do I preserve my purchase power off into the future, knowing that I don't know the future? I don't know how things are going to play out. Ideally, you want more of your debt to be BBB and above, investment grade and above, because that's how you get the negative correlation on your fixed income or bonds to the stocks. If you're really just chasing return and you're trying to say, well, I like the high yield because I get a better dividend out of it, and even if markets are negative, I would just make the argument, increase your stock exposure then. If you are that concerned about having fixed income where your yield on it is not as attractive as you think it should be, or it's not, the tippy top yield because you're seeing all these really big, dividends being paid out by some of these junk bonds, well, consider that a junk bond is likely not going to keep pace with or outpace even the S&P. So if you are the type of investor that says, well, I understand I need fixed income, but I'm going to chase the yield, you may as well just consider having a more properly allocated portfolio, but dial up the equity and dial back the fixed income, but keep the fixed income in the investment grade and above. Now, as far as the asset location goes, let's talk a little bit about that. So when we actually look at the breakout of account values, again, we see a portfolio of just over $2 million. If we're trying to have essentially 40% of this portfolio in fixed income, asset location principles would say that you have to be concerned with the after-tax return of the whole portfolio, not just the brokerage, not just the 401, not just Jane's 401. And so one thing that I did notice when we were looking at the breakout of investments is that if you go account by account, we have fixed income in the taxable, we have stocks in the taxable. We have, close to a 60-40 in Joe's 401, and we have close to a 60-40 within Jane's 401. So while the accounts aren't exactly mirrored, this is a mistake that I see pretty often when it comes to asset location. So asset location is the idea that if you are concerned with the after tax, the treatment of stock in a taxable account can be long-term gains as well as qualified dividend. If you have fixed income in your taxable account, something like, let's say, corporate bonds, government debt, they do not provide qualified dividend. You cannot get qualified dividends from bond funds. So the income that you would earn on the dividends from a bond fund, whether you recognize those within the taxable account or an IRA account, are essentially going to be treated the same. Now, since you're also trying from a, in terms of your return objective with bonds, you're really trying to have bonds again as a counterbalance to the stock. Yeah, you want the dividends, but you're not exactly buying bonds so that you can, create or generate a whole lot of gain from the purchase and sale of the bond later. It's nice if those opportunities present themselves, but they are not the primary motivation in terms of return. It's going to be the income. It is possible to experience long-term gains on bond sales within the taxable account. Bonds are better served from an asset location standpoint, living pretty much exclusively, if possible, within the 401k account or within the pre-tax IRA accounts. And the reason for that is because you don't get qualified dividend. And if you're using up your shelf space in your taxable account for fixed income, well, that's space that could have been used on stock that is over instead in the 401k or in the IRA. When stock is in the IRA account, it doesn't matter if you hold on to it for 10 years or 20 years. You will never get long-term gain and long-term gain tax rates if you have stocks that are inside of an IRA or pre-tax account. When you go to sell it, if you distribute those dollars, let's say you take a distribution from the IRA, what you take out has to be essentially claimed as income. So let's say you had to get some money out of your IRA account and you thought, well, hey, I'll just sell the stock that I've had in here, I'll take the money out. Well, if that stock has done really well and grown and you've had it for greater than a year, you're not going to get the benefit of any of the long-term gain. So what asset location basically says is I'm running a 60-40 across all accounts. I want to put the stock into the accounts where the stock can get the best tax treatment possible. I want to put the bonds then into accounts where the effect is largely just going to simply be the same. So you could run the same 60-40. You could do a 60-40 in the brokerage. You could do a 60-40 in the 401, a 60-40 in the 401k down here for Jane as well. But at the end, when everything is out of the accounts, down the line, when they have, lived their lives and used the accounts, I would expect them to have a lower net after-tax return on accounts if they are holding fixed income in the brokerage when it could have instead been in the 401k or a pre-tax account. So what they could do is they could come over here and make sure that their portfolio is, essentially 100% equity on this taxable brokerage, get the fixed income out of there, get any cash out of there they need to have for a rainy day. And then what they could do is they could come over here to these accounts and basically alter the composition to where instead of this being 65% stock and 35% bonds, it's going to tip more towards the bonds. And what they could ultimately do is mirror the balance between these two accounts. And the reason to do that might just be that so both accounts kind of grow at the same pace and you don't have one spouse that's necessarily outpacing another. But they could come in here and do that. Now, if they were to actually do that, then they would have something that would be much closer to that 60-40 target that they're trying to get to. They would have something that is much more in line with the market weights that we'd see out of something that might be considered more of a modern portfolio construction here. But the big key and the improvement that they've made, and I've made this point so many times, cash drag and tax drag are both compounding effects, but having largely the same portfolio, a 60-40, but placing the investments in such a way to where now the taxable is predominantly or almost 100% equity. The 401k accounts now are taking on a little bit more of the weight of that fixed income here. What this will now do is it will reduce the drag that they will experience from having too much fixed income in taxable accounts when there was plenty of shelf space over in the pre-tax accounts to carry the weight of the bonds, get the reallocation done within the accounts to still have a 60-40, but now they have a better tax efficiency as it relates to how the taxable brokerage is structured in terms of the consideration towards tax drag and more of that tax planning element. Now, the last thing that I'm going to hop us over and discuss, at least from an opportunity standpoint, is just the long-term care. And this is no one's favorite topic to discuss, but there can come a point, and the statistics are out there, that there is a high probability, especially in a married situation, that one or the other spouse may need long-term care coverage. Now, if you don't have long-term care insurance, maybe you're past a point in your life where it's even remotely affordable, you are essentially self-insuring any long-term care need that you may have off into the future. So at least from an opportunity standpoint, Joe and Jane being 65, they might be a little old in terms of trying to get a policy or something that would cover that need. Maybe they could look at something more of a hybrid, like a lower cost universal policy with a long-term care rider. But at the very least, they need to come up with some type of idea or way or strategy to deal with long-term care costs, since they did not put together a long-term care strategy earlier. They don't have any long-term care insurance. So again, the missed opportunity with this is mainly just from a planning standpoint of what is the strategy? What are you going to do? You'd still probably want to go look at and price this stuff just so but having some sort of game plan is going to be critical to help try to understand how you can protect more of your assets should long-term care become an issue. And then everybody, doesn't matter, the opportunity would be estate planning. Joe and Jane do not have a completed will or medical directives or anything related to a trust. That is something that they would also want to make sure they take care of. Have as many assets as possible, avoid probate, but then also have a game plan for the distribution and handling of assets, not just when they pass, but also if they're incapacitated. So these are the opportunities that I saw just in a quick cursory view. Everyone's situation is going to be different. There's a lot more analysis that can go into, a particular situation. If you drew some corollaries between what you saw with Joe and Jane and yourself, and you've never looked at this for yourself, you really ought to consider having some type of review of your situation. But take everything that you've seen with a grain of salt. These were things and observations related in this case study specifically to Joe and Jane. And some of these things you may feel are applicable to yourself, but that's something that you'll have to decide with a proper review of your own situation. Let me know in the comments, what did I miss? What is something that you maybe disagree with or something that you like? Say, hey, I would do the exact same thing, or I heard the same thing, or I heard differently. I really want to know, what are you hearing out there? What are people telling you to consider? What have you maybe yourself done? What do you think could be done to improve this situation or even your own? Let me know in the comments. That's going to help give me ideas for other topics that I can deep dive into. Try to take a look, because again, the whole point of this channel is to help folks build a more tax efficient retirement, certainly, but you also want to have a happy retirement, a healthy retirement, especially from the financial end, a healthy financial retirement as well. So let me know again in the comments if there's something on your mind or something I missed. Ultimately, planning is a process. And in my opinion, the best planning is done from a comprehensive viewpoint. It means managing your cash flows, your budget, your risk mitigation and insurances, and especially your investments. I'd love to know if any of the numbers or circumstances we discussed surprised you, or what you might do differently than what was discussed. So down in the comments, let me know your thoughts, and let me know if there's a particular topic, a concern you'd like me to deep dive and discuss further. And if at any point you thought that proper asset management or comprehensive planning is something you would benefit from, please check out our links and see if we can be a fit to help you. Once more, I'm Curtis Crossland, and if you want to see how we help folks build a more tax-focused and efficient retirement, be sure to check us out at SuttleCrossland.com and subscribe for future videos.